Emily Johnson stood in front of the tall, glass-paneled building, the morning sun casting reflections of the bustling New York skyline across its sleek surface. At 29 years old, she had never stepped foot into a corporate office like this. She clutched a navy blue folder tightly to her chest. Inside, a meticulously prepared resume, copies of personal recommendation letters, and notes she had spent countless nights perfecting. Every detail had been reviewed, rehearsed, and memorized. Her dark blazer, borrowed from a friend, was a little too tight at the shoulders, but she walked through the revolving door with a posture as steady as her resolve. The lobby was immaculate, marble floors gleaming, muted jazz humming through invisible speakers, and a reception desk that looked more like a futuristic command center than a place to greet guests. She approached it slowly, giving her name in a voice that was calm despite the thrum of anxiety in her chest. The receptionist, without even looking up from the screen, gestured toward the elevators. Floor 22. Inside the elevator, she stared at her reflection. Her hair was neatly pinned back, makeup subtle but intentional. She whispered her answers one last time, eyes focused on the numbers climbing steadily toward 22. She had done everything she could to prepare. Still, the nagging thought lingered. Would it be enough? The doors opened with a gentle chime. A glass corridor stretched before her, revealing open-concept offices, modern furniture, and clusters of sharply dressed professionals moving with purpose. No one paid her much attention as she approached the double doors of the interview room. The nameplate beside it bore the title Talent Acquisition Panel. She took one last breath and stepped inside. For people sat at a long table. 3 men and 1 woman, all in their 40s or 50s, each with laptops open and expressions that ranged from bored to mildly curious. They didn't rise to greet her. One of the men, with graying hair and a sharp navy suit, gave a brief nod and gestured to the lone chair across from them. Emily sat down, careful to place her folder on the table in front of her, without making a sound. As she introduced herself, her voice steady and polite, she noticed subtle glances exchanged among the panel. One of them, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, raised an eyebrow as he flipped through her resume. A faint chuckle escaped him as he reached the second page. "Emily Johnson," he said aloud, as if tasting the name. "I see you worked at Tasty Joe's Diner and a customer support call center before that." Emily nodded. "Yes, those were 2 of my main jobs over the last few years." "Interesting path," he muttered, clearly unimpressed. The woman at the table, dressed in a charcoal blazer, asked about her education. Emily explained that she had completed some college courses through a community program, but had to stop halfway due to family obligations. As she spoke, the man with glasses whispered something to his colleague. A low chuckle followed. She heard it. She ignored it. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand from a 2-page resume, was how much it had taken for her to sit in that chair. Emily hadn't been given many chances. She had made them. Every night studying after double shifts, every online certification completed during her lunch breaks, every rejected application that didn't crush her spirit. She wasn't here because it had been easy. She was here because she had refused to give up. Still, the air in the room was thick with quiet judgment. "So," said the man in the navy suit, finally closing her resume, "tell us why you believe you're right for this position." This was the moment she had been practicing for. The part where she would explain her skills, analytical thinking, communication, adaptability. She had rehearsed the sentence structure, her intonation, even the timing of her pauses. But something about the man's tone, the faint smirk on his lips, made her heart skip. Before she could answer, another panelist interjected. "Let me rephrase that," he said, leaning forward. "You don't have a degree. You've never worked in tech. You've served food and answered phones. What makes you think you belong in a company like this?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Emily felt it wrap around her, choking out her rehearsed lines. But she didn't flinch, not visibly. She straightened her shoulders, smiled faintly, and spoke in a tone that was firm yet calm. "I understand where that question comes from," she said. "But I believe you'll find that my experience, while unconventional, has prepared me in ways that are often overlooked." There was no laughter this time, just silence, The interviewers exchanged another look, this one tinged more with intrigue than mockery. Emily wasn't what they expected, not by her background, not by her confidence, and certainly not by the composure she maintained under scrutiny. And in that brief pause, something in the room shifted. Not entirely, not yet, but enough for her to notice. She had entered the building a stranger, a name in a pile of resumes. But now, she had their attention, even if only for a moment. And that, Emily knew, was the beginning of something bigger than any job description could ever capture. A quiet determination settled in her chest as the next question was asked. This was not going to be easy, but she had not come here looking for easy. She had come looking for a chance, and she intended to take it. The room had returned to a deceptive stillness, but under that polished surface, the undercurrent of tension had thickened. After Emily's composed answer, the panel didn't nod or thank her for her response. Instead, they exchanged another round of glances, this time less amused and more calculating. It was as if they had just discovered a new variable in an equation they thought they already solved. Yet their expressions didn't soften. If anything, they grew colder. The man in the navy suit leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "All right then," he said slowly, almost as if savoring the discomfort he assumed would follow. "Let's talk specifics. Have you ever led a project team, handled a budget in the six-figure range, or worked with any real-time analytic systems?" Emily opened her mouth, but before she could answer, another voice jumped in, the younger man in a burgundy tie, his tone laced with forced politeness. "Actually," he said with a half-smile, "I'm curious. When you were at, what was it, Tasty Joe's, did you have to manage any quarterly performance reviews?" There was a quiet snicker from the end of the table. Emily knew what this was. It wasn't curiosity. It was performance. A coordinated display of dominance, masked in the guise of rigorous selection criteria. They weren't evaluating her. They were testing how long it would take to break her. She gave a soft exhale and answered calmly, "No, I didn't manage formal quarterly reviews, but I did lead a team of 7 during our busiest shifts, handle customer complaints, reworked the scheduling to reduce staff burnout, and helped implement a loyalty program that increased our return rate by over 20%. That number, that last piece of information, made the woman on the panel raise her eyebrows slightly. The first real reaction Emily had seen from her, but no one acknowledged the point. The man with glasses, now flipping through her resume again, shook his head and muttered, "It's difficult to measure that sort of experience." Emily didn't reply. She knew better than to defend every inch of her resume. If they wanted numbers, she had numbers. If they wanted leadership, she had stories. But it was clear now. They weren't looking for proof. They were looking for confirmation that she didn't belong. The next question came sharper, colder. "If you're applying for a strategic coordinator role, you'll need to engage with senior stakeholders regularly. Tell me, Miss Johnson, how do you plan to build credibility with executives who view you as nothing more than an assistant?" The directness of it made her chest tighten, but she held her posture. Her fingers, folded neatly over a folder, remained still. "I believe credibility isn't something that comes from a job title or a resume," she said. "It comes from listening carefully, understanding people's concerns, and delivering on what you promise. That's how I built trust in every job I've ever had, whether it was with a regular customer or a frustrated supervisor." Another silence, another flicker of something unreadable on their faces. But then came the laughter again, not loud, not cruel, but sharp enough to cut. The man in the burgundy tie leaned back, arms crossed, and smirked. "That's a very romanticized view of corporate life. You'll find that things don't work quite like that here." Emily nodded. Maybe not, but if that's the case, maybe they should. There it was, quiet but unflinching, a line that could have been career, suicide in a different room. Yet, somehow, she felt no shame in it. She hadn't come here to beg for acceptance. She had come to offer something that couldn't be measured on paper. The mood shifted again, this time not into silence, but into a cold professionalism. The panel's faces hardened. The woman began typing something on her laptop. The man in the navy suit checked his watch. The man with glasses started flipping through his notes, visibly disinterested now. It was clear. They'd heard enough. "Let's wrap this up," said the suit, voice clipped. "We still have 3 more interviews today." Emily nodded and reached for her folder. But before she could stand, the woman, the only one who hadn't yet spoken directly to her, looked up from her screen and said, "Just one last question." Everyone paused. "When you look at this company, at this role, what do you see? What are you really here for, Miss Johnson?" The question was different. Less barbed, less performative. There was something genuinely curious behind it. Emily took a breath. "I see a company that claims to value innovation, adaptability, and human connection. And I see a room that doesn't reflect any of that. Yet, I'm not here because I think I'm better than the other candidates. I'm here because I've been tested in ways that most of them haven't. And I believe that strength matters, especially in teams that want to build something real." The woman didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. "Thank you," she said. And just like that, the moment passed. Emily stood, thanked the panel, and walked toward the door without a backward glance. The hallway outside was empty, quiet. She pressed the elevator button and waited, heart still racing, but not from fear anymore. From clarity, from fire. Inside that room, she had faced something raw, something that many candidates, particularly ones with polished backgrounds, never would. And she hadn't crumbled. She had met contempt with composure, arrogance with honesty. Whatever came next, she knew she had left a piece of herself in that room. Something real, something sharp enough to be remembered. The elevator descended slowly, each floor number lighting up with a soft chime as Emily stood still, her thoughts suspended in a fragile equilibrium. The air inside the lift was cold, sterile, a sharp contrast to the heat pulsing through her veins. She had stepped into that interview room knowing she would face skepticism, but what she encountered had tested her in ways she hadn't entirely anticipated. And yet, something in her remained unshaken, not because it hadn't hurt, but because she had survived worse, much worse. By the time the doors opened the lobby, she had already compartmentalized the experience. She walked past the receptionist, still seated like a statue behind her futuristic desk, and exited into the mid-morning sun of Manhattan. The city was alive, horns, voices, footsteps, vibrations, and as Emily merged the crowd, she allowed herself to exhale fully for the first time that day. She didn't look back at the building. She took the train home in silence. The ride was long, punctuated by screeching tracks and the occasional murmur of conversation. She sat with her folder still clutched in her lap, her fingers absently brushing the corner, as if grounding herself. The faces around her were a blur, commuters in suits, students with earbuds, a mother feeding a child in a stroller, all part of the rhythm of the city that had both challenged and shaped her. At home, her small apartment offered no grand comfort, just quiet, a second-hand couch, a modest kitchen, and a corkboard filled with affirmations, goals, and schedules above her desk. She changed into sweats, tied her hair back, and sat down at her laptop, not to dwell on what had happened, but to move forward. That had always been her way. The interview had been an uphill battle, but she hadn't lost herself in it. And if she were to get the job, it would be on her terms. Not because she mimicked what they expected, but because she showed them what they didn't know they needed. The next day passed slowly. She checked her email more than once, even though she told herself she wouldn't. She wasn't naive. She knew how these things usually ended. People like her didn't walk out of interviews like that with offers. They walked out with bruised pride and unanswered emails. But still, a part of her hoped. That hope flickered 2 days later, when she received a message from the company's HR coordinator. Short, professional, and to the point, they wanted her to return for a second round. It would be a more focused discussion with one of the division heads. She would be speaking directly with someone from the senior leadership team. No panel, no performance, just a conversation. The second interview was scheduled for the following Monday morning. When the day arrived, she prepared again, not with scripted answers or power poses, but with quiet conviction. She wore the same blazer, steamed and brushed. She revised the company's recent projects, studied the executives she would meet with, and reread her own resume not to remind herself of what she had done, but to reclaim the path she had carved. She arrived 15 minutes early. This time, She was met by a different receptionist who actually stood to greet her and offered her water while she waited. The lobby felt less intimidating, but Emily knew better than to read too much into that. She was here for something specific, and she wasn't going to let small gestures distract her from the goal. When she was finally called in, she followed a younger assistant down a quieter hallway into a sleek glass office. Behind the desk stood a tall man in his early 50s, dressed in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the forearms. His handshake was firm, and his demeanor noticeably different from the panelists she had met before. Less rigid, less performative. "Emily," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Thank you for coming back." "Thank you for the opportunity," she replied calmly. He nodded, then settled into his chair and leaned slightly forward, elbows on the desk, fingers interlocked. "I've heard a lot about your first interview." Emily didn't flinch. "I imagine so." He gave a brief smile, then paused as if weighing his next words. "Some of my colleagues were surprised by how you responded. They expected someone with your background to either withdraw or overcompensate." "I didn't either," she said simply. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "No, you didn't. And that's why I wanted to meet you myself." The conversation shifted. He didn't ask for her elevator pitch. Instead, he asked about her transition from night shifts to tech certifications. He asked what she had learned from people who never had the luxury of failure. He asked about the hardest decision she had made in the last 5 years, and listened when she told him it involved choosing between caregiving and college. Then came the moment that would define everything. He closed the file on his desk and leaned back slightly. "One final question, Emily. No right or wrong answer. I just want to understand how you think." She nodded, ready. "Given your lack of conventional experience and knowing how critical this role is, why do you believe we should take the risk on you?" The room stilled. This was not a test of facts or metrics. This was about trust, about belief. She didn't rush her answer. Instead, she looked him directly in the eye. "Because I've already lived what many people only theorize about," she began. "While others studied leadership in classrooms, I had to lead my household at 17. While others practiced case studies, I navigated real crisis, medical, financial, emotional. I didn't get to learn in a safe environment. I had to learn while failing, while working, while surviving." She paused briefly. "Most people enter roles like this with technical knowledge, but no resilience. I come with both. Because I chose to learn, after work, between shifts, when no one believed I would make it. I've had to prove my worth without ever being given the benefit of the doubt. I don't need a safety net to perform. I need a chance." The man didn't speak immediately. He studied her face, his expression unreadable. Then he slowly stood, walked around the desk, and extended his hand. "Thank you, Emily," he said. "That's all I needed to hear." The door clicked shut behind her, and Emily remained still for a moment in the corridor, breathing in the silence. The weight of the last question still lingered in her chest. Not as a burden, but as a solid reminder of what she had just risked. She hadn't played safe, hadn't polished her response to sound corporate or scripted. She had told the truth, not the kind of truth you find in business textbooks, but the kind you earn with sleepless nights, skipped meals, and sheer persistence. And she had said it plainly, to a man who had the power to dismiss her future with a single email. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped in, her movements slower this time. Not from doubt. She had no regrets about what she said, but from the sudden, quiet exhaustion that follows an emotional marathon. This was not just about employment. It had never been. It was about being seen. About taking her story, with all its imperfections, and placing it boldly in a space that was never designed for it. Outside, New York felt warmer. Or perhaps it was just a shift inside her. She walked toward the subway with a strange mix of calm and defiance. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't running on adrenaline. She didn't know what the decision would be, but she knew she had finally spoken from the deepest part of herself. Whatever came of it, she had already taken something back. Her voice, her narrative, her place in a conversation where people like her were usually erased before the first word. 3 days passed before anything arrived. She was washing dishes when the phone buzzed on the counter. A notification. One new email. The subject line was simple. Next steps. Her heart skipped. She dried her hands quickly, pulled the phone closer, and opened the message. The first line made her chest tighten. We'd like to formally extend an offer for the position of strategic project coordinator. She didn't read the rest immediately. Her hand went to the counter for balance. Not because she hadn't believed it was possible, but because she had spent so long being told otherwise, by circumstances, by people, by systems, that her body didn't quite know how to process a reversal. The salary was more than she had dared to hope for. Benefits, onboarding date, contact information for next steps. It was all there, neatly laid out. The final line, however, stood out the most. Your perspective is not only welcome here, it's needed. That evening, Emily sat on her couch, laptop open, phone beside her, letting the reality of it settle around her. She had a job, a real one, in a field where she had once felt like a permanent outsider. And she hadn't gotten there by hiding who she was. She had gotten there by refusing to. The official onboarding was scheduled for following Monday. Her first week would include orientation, one-on-one sessions with different department leads, and a welcome meeting with the executive team. But before all of that, she needed to breathe, really breathe, for the first time in months. Monday arrived quietly. She dressed with care, choosing a soft gray blouse and black slacks. Her blazer was still tight at the shoulders, but she wore it with a different energy now. As she boarded the train toward the office, she carried no folder this time, only her ID and a quiet readiness for what lay ahead. The office lobby greeted her like an old memory. Same marble floors, same cool lighting, but it didn't intimidate her now. She approached the receptionist, who smiled and offered her a guest pass. Moments later, someone from HR met her and led her through a side corridor to a different part of the building she hadn't seen before. The space was brighter, more open, with large glass windows and workstations arranged in collaborative clusters. They passed by teams deep in discussion. Screens filled with charts and timelines, whiteboards covered in scribbles and diagrams. Emily absorbed it all without flinching. She had seen more chaotic environments. The difference was here, the chaos came with coffee machines and lunch breaks, not midnight buses and emergency bills. In the conference room where her orientation would begin, there were already 3 new hires seated. One was a recent graduate from Yale, the second from a prestigious business school overseas, and the third a former analyst from another tech giant. They each nodded as she sat beside them. Their presence didn't rattle her. She had no reason to feel less. The HR coordinator entered and began the session. The slides were clean, the language polished. Company mission, values, organizational structure, expectations. Emily listened carefully, taking notes where needed, but her mind was anchored to one question. How would the culture she had glimpsed during her first interview coexist with the mission they now presented? Later that afternoon, she met again with the man who had given her the second interview. He greeted her warmly, offered her coffee, and motioned for her to sit in a smaller office that overlooked the city. I wanted to check in personally, he said. Make sure your first day isn't just a blur. It's been smooth so far, she replied. A lot to take in, but nothing overwhelming. He nodded. Good. That's what we want. We know onboarding can set the tone for everything else. She appreciated the directness in his tone. No fluff, no small talk for the sake of it. He leaned forward. I also want to say that your response in the interview, the final question, stayed with me. Not because it was emotional, but because it was honest. We need more of that. Emily didn't respond right away. She wanted to make sure her words mattered now as much as they had in that earlier room. I've never believed honesty and professionalism were opposites, she said. Sometimes the most important thing you can bring into a room is your unpolished truth. His gaze met hers, thoughtful. Then let's hope more people start following that lead. They ended the meeting with a handshake, and as Emily returned to her temporary desk to complete the final onboarding forms, she noticed something subtle but unmistakable. A few of the same people who had interviewed her during that first panel were walking down the hallway. One of them paused when their eyes met. No smirk, no dismissive glance, just a brief nod of acknowledgement, quiet but sincere. Emily turned back to her screen and kept working. The company hadn't changed overnight. She knew that, The world didn't work that way, but a door had opened, not just for her, but maybe, in some small way, for others like her who would come after. And she intended to make sure it stayed open. The first week passed in a blur of introductions, system walkthroughs, and long onboarding sessions that layered procedures and expectations like thin sheets of glass. Transparent, but piling up fast. Emily took it all in quietly, methodically, storing every name, every acronym, and every unwritten rule. She was learning a new language, one spoken not in grammar and syntax, but in power structures, implicit alliances, and coded expectations. The workplace was polished, hyper-efficient, designed for seamless collaboration. But beneath the gleam, she could feel it. The quiet hierarchy, the unspoken test of belonging that extended beyond credentials and titles. She was given a desk in a shared office space with two analysts who barely acknowledged her at first. They spoke to each other in clipped, technical shorthand, referencing models and dashboards as if she weren't there. Emily didn't take offense. She understood what was happening. It wasn't personal. It was a ritual, the kind that played out silently in institutions that claimed inclusion but hadn't yet reconciled their own definitions of it. You proved yourself not by your resume, but by surviving the cold shoulder, the vague instructions, the meetings you were invited to but not included in. It was a trial, and she recognized it for what it was. On her third day, she was assigned her first real task, to assist with the planning phase of a cross-functional product launch. Her role was limited to logistics, setting timelines, managing documentation, tracking progress across departments. It was a starting point, but Emily saw the bigger picture. Every email she sent, every report she filed, was a chance to study the system from within. She mapped connections between departments, observed who held informal influence, and noted how meetings were structured, who spoke freely, who hesitated, and who was heard even in silence. One afternoon, during a routine sync call, a technical lead dismissed one of her suggestions without looking up from his notes. "We'll handle that differently. Just make sure the tracking sheet stays updated." Emily had anticipated resistance. She didn't argue, but she quietly implemented a version of her proposal within the tracking system, a categorization method that highlighted dependencies more clearly. 2 days later, the same lead referred to her chart during a department update and praised the clarity of the structure. No mention of her name, no credit. But again, she didn't flinch. Recognition wasn't the prize. Influence was, and she had just shifted the room without raising her voice. Still, not all moments passed quietly. On Friday morning, she was asked to join a high-level strategy session for the product launch. The email had no explanation, just a calendar invite with 10 names she didn't recognize, except one, the executive who had hired her. She arrived early as always and took a seat near the end of the table. The room filled quickly, mostly with senior leads who exchanged familiar nods and began discussing timelines, risk assessments, and resourcing issues. No one acknowledged her presence. Halfway through, as the conversation turned toward user experience bottlenecks, Emily saw an opening. One of the leads mentioned delays in collecting feedback from end users in their beta environment, and the room fell into the kind of silence that begged for a solution but didn't want to admit it lacked one. She cleared her throat gently. "If I may, there's an existing feedback loop in the customer service channel that isn't currently being tapped for beta-specific insights. With minimal adjustment, it could be routed directly into the UX backlog." The room paused. For a moment, she thought perhaps she had overstepped. But then the executive who had brought her in turned his head, one eyebrow raised slightly. "Explain." She outlined the structure in 3 concise points: technical feasibility, minimal cost, and short integration time. She didn't oversell it. She didn't hedge. "Just facts," calmly delivered. The UX lead nodded slowly. "That could work," she said. Another manager chimed in to agree. The conversation resumed, this time folding her input into the next round of planning, as if it had always been part of the process. No applause, no grand acknowledgement, just a subtle shift in direction, a room realigning itself around an idea that had not been there before she spoke. Later that day, as she returned to her desk, one of the analysts who had ignored her earlier passed by and paused. He didn't say much, Just a brief, quiet, nice call in the meeting. Then he moved on. But that 2-second acknowledgement cracked something open. It wasn't praise that mattered. It was evidence that her presence was no longer being edited out of the narrative. The real change, however, came the following week. She was called into a one-on-one meeting with the executive sponsor of the product launch, a woman named Marla Reyes, known internally for her sharp instincts and no-nonsense leadership style. The invitation had been unexpected. Reyes ran her division with precision and rarely spent time with newcomers. Emily arrived 5 minutes early, as always, and waited outside the executive's office until called in. Reyes sat at a minimalist desk, no clutter, no distractions, just a laptop and a single notebook. She didn't offer small talk. "I've been hearing your name in meetings," she said directly. Emily kept her response neutral. "I've tried to contribute where I can." Reyes studied her for a moment. "You're doing more than that. You're making people pause. That doesn't happen often here. Most ideas move in a circle from senior to senior. Yours came from outside the ring. People noticed." Emily didn't know what to say to that, not because she was unsure of her value, but because she hadn't expected anyone to admit it out loud. "I'm putting together a smaller task force," Reyes continued, "for the next phase of the rollout. Fewer politics, more execution. I want you on it." Emily blinked. It wasn't a question. "I'd be honored," she replied, voice steady. The meeting ended quickly. No ceremonial handshake, no grand declaration. Just a quiet shift. The kind that ripples slowly through systems not built for women like her, and especially not for women who refuse to conform to them. She returned to her desk and stared at the screen, the cursor blinking in an open document. Her to-do list was long, her schedule packed, her energy already stretched. But none of that mattered. She wasn't just inside the room now. She was shaping it.